Imagine breaking your leg. Not today. With an ambulance and a hospital and clean white plaster. Imagine breaking it 30,000 years ago. A snapped bone, deep in the wilderness, with no doctor, no painkillers, no surgery, no antibiotics. Just you, the pain, and a world that does not wait for the weak. You'd assume that's a death sentence. That in the brutal ancient past, an injury like that meant the end. You fall behind, you can't hunt, you can't run, and the harsh logic of survival takes over. But the bones tell a different story. A stranger. And frankly, a more beautiful one than anyone expected. Because when archaeologists dig up our distant ancestors, they keep finding skeletons with terrible injuries. Shattered legs, broken arms, wounds that should have been fatal. And those bones show something astonishing. They healed. Which means these people didn't die from their injuries. They survived them. Sometimes for many years afterward. And that one fact unravels into a story about our ancestors that will completely change how you picture them. Let's start with those healed bones, because they're hiding something profound. When you break a major bone, you become helpless. You cannot walk. You cannot find food. You cannot defend yourself. For weeks, sometimes months, you are completely dependent on others just to stay alive. Someone has to bring you food. Someone has to bring you water. Someone has to protect you while you cannot protect yourself. So every healed fracture in the ancient record is not just evidence of a body recovering. It is evidence of a group that chose to care for someone who, in pure survival terms, had become a burden. That fragile, injured person was fed, sheltered, and kept alive by people who could have left them behind and didn't. Think about what that means. In a world with barely enough food, where every day was a fight, a whole group decided that one hurt person was worth the cost of carrying. Those healed bones aren't just medicine. They're proof of compassion, tens of thousands of years old. They are, in a very real sense, some of the oldest evidence we have of human love. Now, our ancestors couldn't stop at just keeping the injured comfortable. They actually treated them. And what they figured out with no science, no anatomy books, no understanding of germs, is genuinely hard to believe. Take a broken bone. We know that many prehistoric peoples could set fractures. They would straighten the limb and then pack it in clay, which dried hard into a solid cast, holding the bone still so it could knit back together properly. A Stone Age cast, working on the exact same principle as the plaster one a hospital would give you today. Then there's the medicine cabinet they built out of the world around them. With nothing but trial, error, and generations of hard-won observation, ancient people discovered that certain plants did remarkable things to the human body. They chewed willow bark to ease pain and bring down fever. And they were right too. Willow bark contains a compound closely related to the active ingredient in aspirin, the same painkiller sitting in your medicine cabinet right now. They had essentially found aspirin, growing on a tree, thousands of years before chemistry existed to explain why it worked. Think about the sheer number of lifetimes of patient observation that took. Someone had to notice that people who chewed this particular bark hurt a little less, and pass that knowledge down over and over across countless generations until it became medicine. They used honey to dress open wounds. And again, this wasn't superstition. Honey is a genuine natural antibacterial. Spread over a wound, it actively fights off the bacteria that cause infection while keeping the wound moist to heal. In some parts of the world, wounds were packed with certain clays and absorbent mosses that helped stop bleeding and keep infection out. In the Americas, there's evidence of a truly ingenious trick, using the pincers of large ants as tiny natural stitches. The ant was held over a wound until it bit down, clamping the edges of the cut together, and then the body was twisted off, leaving the head in place as a clasp. These people were running a functioning pharmacy and an emergency room built entirely from plants, insects, and earth. But none of that compares to what they were willing to do next. Because ancient people didn't just treat wounds. They performed surgery. On the skull. Of living, conscious patients. It's called trepanation. And it is exactly as intense as it sounds. It involved cutting, scraping, or drilling a hole directly through a living person's skull. We have found roughly 1,500 skulls from the ancient world bearing these holes, scattered across nearly every populated continent, with a huge concentration in the Andes of South America. The earliest known example goes back about 7,000 years. Now, here's the part that should stop you cold. When you look at the edges of the holes in these skulls, you can see the bone has grown back. It has healed, smooth, and rounded. And healed bone means one thing. The patient was alive. They survived having a hole cut into their skull and then lived for months or years afterward. And they didn't just survive occasionally. At some sites, the success is staggering. In parts of prehistoric France, more than 70% of trepanned skulls show clear signs of healing. Let that sink in. To put it in perspective, when European hospitals performed similar skull surgeries in the 1800s, their patients often died at horrifying rates, sometimes with survival barely reaching 10% because surgeons kept spreading infection with dirty hands and dirty tools. Stone Age healers, working with sharpened flint, were dramatically outperforming Victorian hospitals, thousands of years earlier. How? We can't be certain. But part of the answer is likely that these ancient communities were far away from the crowded, filthy cities where deadly germs thrive. And part of it is that they almost certainly had a deep, sophisticated knowledge of antiseptic plants and clean technique that we are only beginning to appreciate. They understood, in practice if not in theory, how to keep a wound from turning deadly. Now, a moment of honesty because it matters. Bones can only tell us so much. A healed skeleton proves someone survived and that someone cared for them, but it can't always tell us the full story of exactly what was done or why. Some of these treatments, like trepanation, may have been as much about ritual and spirit as medicine. We're reading a story from fragments, and we should be humble about the parts we can't see, but the fragments we do have are extraordinary, because step back and look at what they actually achieved. With no microscopes, no germ theory, no chemistry, no anatomy, they set bones with clay. They found the painkiller in a tree and the antibiotic in honey. They performed brain surgery with stone tools, and their patients lived. And through it all, they carried the injured, fed the helpless, and refused to abandon their own. We tend to picture ancient people as brutish and primitive, barely clinging to life. But that picture is wrong. They were resourceful, observant, deeply intelligent, and above all, they cared for each other with a tenderness that reaches across tens of thousands of years to touch us now. So the next time you take a pill for a headache or get a cast for a broken arm, remember, you are not using new ideas. You are using very, very old ones, refined over an unimaginable stretch of time by people who loved each other enough to keep trying. They had no doctors, so they became them, for each other.